And so I characterize my work as getting above strategy. It boils down to what's going on in the world. What does it mean for where you play? And the most important part is, what are the right questions you should be asking?
Welcome to ThoughtSparks. Like, subscribe, comment, share, and enjoy.
Well, hello, everyone. Rita McGrath here on another edition of the ThoughtSparks podcast. And my guest this week is going to be a special treat. He's a futurist. He's a consultant to firms all over the world. He's got a very interesting perspective on the future, on strategy, on where we are right now. He's been involved with the Shell Corporation, which is also very well known for its views of the future. And he's here to share some of his wisdom with us today. So welcome, Roger Dennis.
Hi, Rita. It's nice to be here.
It's great to have you. So, nobody kind of wakes up in the morning and decides, oh, I want to be a futurist. Could you give us some background on how you got there? And then I know you've got some slides and things prepared for us, which I'd love to have our audience get into.
Sure. So I really got into this, about 30 years ago. I was working for a group in London, and we were tasked with understanding where opportunity might sit, where risk might sit for the business at a very high level. And it was fascinating to me to watch some of those discussions going on, but they weren't at the right level. And it really occurred to me that you need to be at a higher level in understanding what's going on in the world to really create value, mitigate risk, and realize opportunity for organizations. The work I was doing in London was probably sitting about third or fourth tier, and just watching it go up the stack and having management just look at it and just thinking well, this sounds ridiculous. How does it fit in? Some of the work we did turned out to be, very, very significant opportunities for the business. But because I didn't understand the context of how it sat and where the opportunities would lie within their structure, it was ignored. And so from that point on, I looked around to understand where you would actually create impact. As you mentioned earlier, I spent some time working alongside the Shell Game Changer team in The Hague, and it was fascinating to watch how that organization really valued future thinking.
Well, and I think that is something that has been part of their DNA for quite a long time. So, Ari de Hughes wrote this fabulous book, The Living Company, where he and his little hardy band of researchers tried to track down what was the secret to corporate longevity and came up with these principles that among them are having this sort of broad perspective on where the organization fits and what its future looks like. So you've talked about, sitting above strategy as something which sounds a little counterintuitive. You need to thinking about the future. Isn't that what strategy is really for? So maybe expand on that notion a bit.
Yeah, so what I find is that when you are sitting inside organizations, people have lots of different ways of thinking about strategy. They have their own favorite theories, their own favorite schools of thought. But generally what they do is discount what's happening in the wider world. And so I characterize my work as getting above strategy. It boils down to what's going on in the world. What does it mean for where you play? And the most important part is, what are the right questions you should be asking? So often what I see is strategy being developed devoid of that understanding. And effectively what happens is there will be a 3 or a 5 year cycle in place. Something happens and a team goes, well, we didn't expect that. That's not in the strategy, because they've just been really narrowly focused looking down into their part of the world and not looking out wide. And as we've seen over the last few years, shocks can come from places where people don't really understand what's going on, and they become very reactive. So getting above strategy is really helping organizations getting to the right question, and you're far better to have an approximate answer to the right question than the exact answer to the wrong question. And organizations, I find, particularly in strategy, do not spend enough time finding out what the right question is.
Yeah, I would totally endorse that. So what I would observe is when I work with companies, they're so busy They're just so completely wrapped up in, and justifiably so. There's a lot to look after in a current enterprise, especially with what's going on with all the shifts in the world that could have a big impact. But the discipline to take that time and step back and take that broader view, I think, is something that leaders really struggle with.
Yes.
So here we are in the context of, that geopolitical unrest. We've got raw materials shocks. We've got tariffs. We've got unpredictability in government. What grab bag bucket list of all kinds of stuff. What are some of the things you're sort of paying attention to right now?
Yeah. So my top list would be fast-moving technology. That includes AI, but not limited to AI. Climate change, demographics, democracy, and geopolitics. And within that, what I've observed over the years is there's a particular cascade that happens, which is highly relevant to leaders, which is technology moves very fast and creates changes in the employment market. When those changes become headlines, politicians start to take note. But the challenge is, in most Western democracies around the world, they have a 3 or a 4-year cycle, and they are really unable to get their head around complex system interactions that create these changes. So this cascade between technology, employment, and politics really does shape up quite a lot and explain the rise of populism at the moment, where leaders basically sell this idea that we can take the country back to a time when things were predictable, when you woke up knowing that your children have a better outcome than yourself, and by promising stability, what they do is get quite a lot of votes, because there's so much going on in the world. If someone stands up and says, I can take care of it, I'll make things stable and understandable, it's extremely attractive. So this cascade between technology, jobs, and politics is really important to understand. But there are other things going on as well. So climate, for example, democracy, and geopolitics.
And do you have any particular red flags or anything that you sort of suggest companies need to, what is there a framework or something you suggest companies particularly need to hone in on?
Yeah, so I think at the level of getting above strategy, leaders need to think about 3 things. One of which is, do they have the capabilities to have these conversations? And by capabilities, people like myself typically trigger difficult and challenging conversations, which normally aren't held at a leadership table. And then what you find is that if you can start those conversations, if you have specific capabilities from experienced people, then you need to understand how they run as a process, rather than just pulling stuff out of the air. Actually have a defined process that you can work through. And then the third part of this is routines. How often do you run that? So it just amazes me at the moment, for example, that talking to chief executives or heads of strategy teams in medium-sized businesses, that there's this view that we don't need to worry about what's going on in the world. We've got that covered. Our strategy refresh is going on right now, so we just can't get involved in that. And it is extraordinary, at this point in time where the world is going through arguably the biggest energy shock in history, that a leadership team can go, nope, we're just doing our strategy cycle. We do it every 3 years. We're just going to keep on going with that.
I find it hard to believe that there's any organization on the planet that thinks that's okay.
Yeah, likewise. It's dumbfounding to me.
So, we talked about this level of volatility, and and I've shared this perspective, at least that I have, that we're in this massive transition from, as you said, the world that was dependent on cheap energy and that fueled so much of the economic activity and growth, and we're moving into some other way of being because we don't have 8 planets to burn, and we have the digital revolution, and products are increasingly getting replaced by services, and manufacturing at a mass level is giving way to very personalized units of consumption and so forth. Do you think we're at a unique time, or do you think there are precedences for this?
So there are definitely precedents for levels of volatility in history. So if you go back to like the mid 1800s, there was an astonishing range of new technologies being launched. Telegraph, electricity networks, ships go around the world non-stop. I mean, it completely shattered the paradigms of the time. There have been other similar fast-moving shocks, but the one that's probably most recent for people would be the late 60s, early 70s, where you saw just an extraordinary level of volatility around the world. You had millions rioting on the streets of Paris. You had the North Korean Navy seizing US ships. You had Tet Offensive. You had war in the Middle East. You had the birth of the space race. It just went on and on and on. And if you look at some of the commentary about that period, people said it felt like the world was on fire and there was no way out. But here we are, after that, arguably you had decades of growth. I think what is fundamentally different about what we're in the middle of now is that we've got two things that haven't existed before. First of all, we have machines that create faster machines without human intervention. So that's various versions of artificial intelligence, which are developing at an extraordinary rate. And then we have the fact that we're blowing past planetary boundaries. You mentioned we don't have enough planets to burn through what we're doing. And there's been this history of colonizing the future, discounting the real cost of this form of growth. And so those two things, I think, are creating this fundamental difference in comparison to previous levels of volatility.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And are there sort of a real world example that you could share? Just sort of play that scenario?
Yeah, there's obviously what's going on in the Straits of Hormuz as we're recording this is fascinating because there's talk of putting tolls on ships that pass. And that has sparked discussions in various parts of the world. So last week, a senior Indonesian official made some passing comment about maybe they could put a toll on the Straits of Malacca. Now, this feels like we're going back to sort of this medieval feudalism time where there's no longer freedom of navigation, there's no longer, the ability to travel freely around the world. And this is quite remarkable, like a fundamental change. And then if you sort of abstract that back out again, one of the questions that I'm asking is, on the longer scale of history, is this a reversion to the mean or a deviation from the norm? So by that, what I mean is basically since the end of World War II, we've had the rules-based international order. That's lasted an extraordinarily long time. But now we've had years of volatility and change as institutions are breaking down. Is the last few years' volatility a deviation from 1945? And we're going to go back to something that feels a bit more comfortable and familiar? Or are we looking at the post-1945 era being a deviation from the norm? So since 1945, has that been an abnormal time in history? And we're going back to this medieval feudalism time, sort of pre-1900. In my mind, that's the key question right now. And that's the question I'm not really seeing considered at all in boardrooms. But I think that's quite fundamental to understanding where things could go in the world.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I guess I'm hopeful. I'm a bit of an optimist, and I see efforts to sort of reshape some of these new institutions, new ways of doing things, and there's plenty of arguments on both sides. So I guess it's going to be a function of having to discover what's new. So you said you had something to share with our viewers.
Yes.
Would you like to do that?
So one of the things that really quite challenges people is how to get your head around everything that's going on. And I'm a big fan of frameworks and mental models to help people get their head around some of these changes and these discussions. And key to it is understanding how complex systems interact. And so there's this lovely way of thinking about it where there are layers of complex systems And generally what you find is that friction between these two systems as they're layered creates quite a bit of change. You find that when you look at the order of these complex systems, generally change at the top of the stack doesn't affect the bottom, but the bottom of the stack is nature, natural systems, and changes in there ricocheted right back up through governance, through culture, through infrastructure, and straight into commerce. And so I'll show you an example of what I mean by this. I'll just share something here, and I'll talk you through exactly what that looks like. So what you find is this. I've got an abstract sort of representation. It looks like a Jenga tower, and I call this layer player. And effectively, at the very top is commerce, and it's in yellow in the example. And then below that you have infrastructure, then governance, then culture and nature. And what I find is that generally in boardrooms and most leadership conversations, say most but not all, they are very focused on the commerce layer. They might dig down into the layer below infrastructure at one point, but generally discount the effect of complex system changes anything below that. But when you look at how some of these things are changing rapidly, so below commerce, there's a layer called infrastructure, AI sits in there. When those blocks start to move very quickly, then the stability on the top layer doesn't look so stable anymore. When you start going down into governance, then changes in democracy around the world mean that stability is threatened further. When you look into culture, like it would be language, religion, etc., you're seeing polarization emerge now in many countries that further challenges the stability on top. And as I mentioned earlier, natural systems at the base of the layer. If you move too many blocks at the bottom, Jenga style, the whole thing collapses. So this is a framework I call layer player. And I use this with boards and executive teams to really bring this to life. It's a homage to the work done by Stuart Brand in California, who developed the PACE layers model. And one of the things I find is that often you can have these conversations with people, but when you bring it to life with tangible examples, their understanding changes. So you can talk about this in the abstract form, but as soon as people see the layer player model, they go, now I understand it. And so, I built models like that. I give them to executive leaders and they take pride of place on their desk. I've had leaders come up to me and say, how can I get one of those? Can you send me one of those? Because it gives them some model to understand how these changes are creating effects that they wouldn't otherwise have a framework to understand these by.
Yeah, and I think what I find very what I think executives find very tricky is, you make a move that in the frame that you're using seems perfectly sensible, and then you discover all these unexpected second order, third order, fourth order consequences that you really weren't anticipating.
Yes.
And people just seem to really struggle having the mental ability to follow these things to their natural conclusions. And so you end up with these paradoxes, such as Steve Kerr wrote about in his wonderful article, the folly of rewarding A while hoping for B.
It's nice.
We just want these systems that are meant to do one thing and then end up doing another. So he uses the example of, all of us would agree that we'd like our politicians to be very clear and very precise about what it is they hope to do in office. And yet what we reward is politicians who are unclear, fuzzy, don't use the correct language, or and if somebody's actually straightforward about, I'm going to raise your taxes to do X, Y, Z, then they get voted out of office. So, we don't get what we want because we're not rewarding.
Yes. And so my sort of standing line is you'll never see a political campaign that has the tagline, the world is made up of many complex interacting systems. We're not quite sure how they're going to interact, but we're doing our best to have difficult conversations about the impact on you. That just doesn't fit on a billboard, right?
Not much of a slogan. Not much of a slogan.
But it's also, you raise an interesting point there, because what I find is that most leaders today have earned their leadership experience in a time of relative stability. So a whole bunch of the frameworks and models that they might use subconsciously are being applied to an era of volatility now. And what they find is that actually they don't work. So a classic easy example of this would be the 3 or 5 year strategy cycle. And when you have conversations with someone saying, I really think you should be understanding how the world might look and some of the fundamental shifts that are going on at the moment. Like I said earlier, they go, stop there. We're just in the middle of our 3-year refresh and we don't really have the ability to fit that in. My response is, how could you not fit that in?
I think elsewhere you've used the metaphor coffee without a cup.
Yes, that's exactly what it's like. We'll just keep pouring with no receptacle and we'll just wait and see what happens.
Right. So all right. So say an organization engages you, they're enlightened enough to say, well, gee, we want to devote some mental atoms to thinking about the future. How do you take them through it?
Yes. So, typically what happens is, first of all, somebody called it the shock and awe presentation. And
Okay.
and it was really interesting to me to hear it called that, because often the first point of engagement with an organization is sitting down with a board or an LT and just talking them through what's going on at the moment and where some of the implications might be from those interactions between systems. And I run these quite regularly. Clients said to me, oh, Roger, so-and-so organization, they would benefit from the shock and awe presentation that you do. And I went, I don't really do a shock and awe presentation. That's just like outlining what's going on in the world right now. But it is fascinating to see that reaction, because people, when you actually spell out how these complex systems are moving, it's like you just peel back the shades and people haven't thought about that. So typically what I do, first of all, is help people understand models for how the world is evolving at a macro scale. And then we get down to, there's really two sort of clients I end up with. One, I would do an initial session with a board or an LT, and I'll bump into one of them in an airport lounge or something later on, and I'll say, how are you doing? How did you find the session? And they'll go, it was great. I go, that's good. And I took lots of notes, Roger. It was very good. I go, and they go, oh no, notes are really good. And then the other camp is you get to the end of that session with the board and LT, and someone will go, what do we need to do? Like, how do we actually start to get our head around this and not be surprised? And typically that becomes an engagement where you start fleshing out some of the really critical questions. So, and coming back to that framework at the start I talked about, is where is the world going? What does it mean for where you play? And what are the right questions you should be asking before you start thinking about options and strategic responses? And that's typically where we get to with, forward-thinking clients.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I find sometimes people act, when there's so much uncertainty, it almost feels good to take some kind of action, even if it's probably not the correct action.
Yes.
I was at a conference the other day, and there was an analyst there who said he had consistently, over many, many years, bet against Netflix. And the audience was saying, why would you bet against Netflix? I mean, you look at them, they're this incredibly successful company. They've done all this. He said, because I simply could not believe that the content studios would be stupid enough to license all this stuff to Netflix and give them essentially the keys to completely disrupting the ecosystem as it existed. He said, I just couldn't believe they couldn't see that that's where this was all going.
That's a great insight.
Isn't that a great example?
Yes.
And he's I just couldn't believe it. And so, when I think about it, if I just take that specific example of missing what could be going on in your future, when Netflix first started, the content they had was all these sort of reruns and older, content, and it had completely been through the whole industry cycle. So, you have the movie, and then you have the re-release of the movie, and then you have the television, and then maybe it go into Blockbuster and you could rent it. And then eventually it went into sort of rerun land and it disappeared. And so to the studios, at first blush, this was awesome. It was a way to get incredible revenue from assets that were no longer valuable. And yet, as we know now with the wisdom of hindsight, what that did was that it gave Netflix enough oxygen to get going and create a viable economic engine. And then by the time the studios realized kind of how bad this was, they were in a position to now make their own content, so they were no longer dependent. So it's a really interesting story to me of kind of not seeing several moves ahead when you're thinking strategically.
Yes, but also I find with that story, the reaction is interesting. When that person talks about it on stage, people go, well, why wouldn't you bet on Netflix? And that's like this bias which says, in hindsight, I'm perfectly informed.
Uh-huh. Absolutely. So when leaders are thinking about the current situation, are there some specific things you would encourage them to, stop doing perhaps, or to start doing?
Yes. So the thing they should start doing is using experts in this space. And so that is a comment which is something I've learnt over the years, where organisations, if they have a legal problem, they will hire lawyers. If they have an audit problem, they will hire a professional accounting firm. For some reason, some organisations think that if they want to do scenarios and think about the future, they can hire someone who's watched a couple of science fiction movies, talk to some young people, and therefore they are well equipped to map out where the future of the organisation might fit. Mm-hmm. I've seen that fail spectacularly. You need to think about, how do you bring expertise into the organisation that can really help you start these difficult and challenging conversations in a way that takes it from, stratospheric insights right down into what does it mean for the organisation. Because there's absolutely no value for an organisation just having interesting conversations, taking lots of notes, great. You really need to think about a structured process which you run on a regular basis, where you can go from these difficult conversations into strategic outcomes. And the other thing you should be doing is both mitigating risk and trying to find opportunity. Because there's opportunity in volatility. There's loads of examples of that, and I'll give you a really tangible one. So in 2015, I led a small team, and we spent 4 months analysing the impact of a global pandemic. We started looking at second-order implications. We got right through to supply chains very quickly. We published a report in New Zealand, where I'm based, 147 pages, clear responses and recommendations for government, for organisations, for individuals. We went round very senior government officials and chief execs, and the collective response was, Roger, pandemics, that's so 1800s. Why are you bothering with that? And then come sort of early January 2020, myself and colleagues started noticing these things that in my world we call weak signals. So we was looking for patterns where things aren't going quite right. You see signals that indicate something's not quite setting into a normal pattern. So we started to get increasingly concerned. In February, I was helping clients set up crisis management teams well before they realised they needed to do so. But then one of my clients at the time was a bit of an anomaly for me. They're a small specialist digital shop. And we had a long conversation, I remember it quite clearly, sat down with a whiteboard in late February 2020, and we looked at what would a digital first response to a pandemic be. And in New Zealand, that became this thing called the COVID Tracer app. And effectively what that meant was that New Zealanders could actually carry on life as normal with zero COVID in the country for months and months. But that particular company that developed the COVID Tracer app, it powered their growth for 2 or 3 years when competitors were shutting down because they weren't getting work overseas, they couldn't travel, no one was buying, companies were closing. But this particular company just grew and grew and grew. So they saw opportunity in volatility. They moved decisively to take advantage of that, and they had tremendous growth out of it.
Mhm. So I think that's a really interesting example some of our listeners might not really be aware of. So when most of the world had shutdowns and businesses weren't allowed to open and restaurants were closed and everything, all my friends in New Zealand said, well, things here are pretty normal. And you'd see
Yes.
pictures on social media of people at restaurants and theaters and all that. But that didn't just happen. That was a series of very deliberate government policies. Now, I understand this was not without controversy.
Yes, there was controversy around, particularly, well, not initially in the shutdown process, but more around the vaccination process. And there's lots of different schools of thought around how that was handled. But the initial response to ensure that the population was safe was really predicated around the use of people having this app where they could scan when they're going into shops, etc. If there was a COVID case, it was very easy to track people right back through, understand who else would be exposed and send them messages. It worked extremely well.
Hmm. It's really interesting. I think many parts of the rest of the world would wish they'd been that organized. Um, so, um, so I mean, people love examples of kind of how this worked its way through an organization. So, and I guess maybe one of the things I'd be interested in is when I tell people the future's not going to be like the past and it's going to be very different. They kind of break into different clumps, right? You've got the people that are very eager to learn and want to do more and want to be open, and yes, they'll actually take action if they're persuaded. Then you've got that sort of clump in the middle that they're intrigued, they're taking notes, but they're not actually doing anything. And then you've got the ones who really don't want to hear what you have to say and
Yes.
really, really, really would prefer that you disappear and go away. And so how do you deal with those various constituencies as you're trying to get a company to act in its own best interest?
That's a great question. I think it's a mindset. And often when I talk, people sort of end up back in their seats in a bit of shock. And I say to them, actually, the way ahead is not going to be straightforward, but there is a way ahead. And you need to have this mindset of realistic optimism. It's going to be difficult, but there's a way forward. And what's interesting about this is that studies have shown that optimists generally have a lower level of mental health because they're always thinking the world's going to be better, and then a shock happens and it hits them. Pessimists, very similar. Things are going to go wrong all the time, hits their mental health. But actually this idea, sort of in the middle, realistic optimism, is the mindset that really helps you front into this. And also what's interesting is that people sort of default to the here and now. So they get quite reactive. And I'll give you an example of this. So about 3 years ago, I ran a session for about 400 directors across Australasia. And I was very interested to understand how their hindsight filters would work when it came to thinking about the pandemic. So I asked them a couple of questions. I'm going to share my screen again and show you what happened here, which was effectively what you saw was an example where I said, would you have liked to have had more insight about the pandemic before it occurred? And you can see from this chart here, 90% of people said yes. I'm not quite sure what the other 10% were thinking, but 90% said, hell yes, we would have loved to have known before the pandemic. So we could have adjusted, we could have had a proactive response. So then the next logical question is, so given that you would have loved to have advance warning of the pandemic, then how many of the organizations that you're involved in now have capabilities, processes, and routines to actually understand where the next shock might be, to mitigate risk and realize opportunity? And this is the response. So less than 30% said, yes, we have a capability to do that. And over 70% just went, well, not really. I find that fascinating because what it talks about is elasticity of thinking. So because I'd done the work in 2015, what happened in my case was we got to, in New Zealand, probably about April, May in 2020. And I quite clearly remember a chief exec in particular ringing me up and saying, we read your report about 2015. We'd like you to come and talk to our board. And as you know, board agendas are set months in advance. It's very hard to get on the agenda. You have very limited time. So I said to this chief exec, great, are we talking about September or October? And she said, Monday. And I went, okay. And I'm presuming it's Monday. We'll be looking like a 15-minute slot. She said, how long do you want?
Wow.
And that's really interesting because basically the elasticity of risk appetite and understanding that had gone right out. Now what you find is it's snapped right back in and people want to get back to normal. Things would be great when they're just back to normal. I was talking to a chief exec of a global logistics company about a week and a half ago. And one of their clients is a very large food manufacturer and distributor. And they were talking in relation to the current crisis in the Middle East and the impact on fuel prices. And their supply chain manager said, it's really annoying because we're almost back to normal. I thought, wow, how does that person think there is a normal? I mean, if there is a normal, I would love someone to tell me what it is because I'm not sure what the normal is right now.
I see that all the time. People like, yeah, and even in the field of strategy, one of the sort of guiding assumptions of industrial economics, which is where the strategy field in academia came from, one of their dominant assumptions is that the normal state of things is equilibrium. And that you may have, a perturbation now and again, but that eventually things settle back into some kind of quantifiable, measurable state. And I've always thought that was a very suspect assumption. How, what?
Yeah, I think you're being very kind with your assessment of that assumption.
But, at the same time, and to be fair to leaders and executives, I don't think human beings do very well when they're just left to swim in a sea of complete uncertainty. It either invokes sort of our limbic alarm systems and we get flight or fright, or we just get frozen and we can't move anywhere. So how do you get people from that state of, as you described it, shock and awe, to having the courage to at least take a sensible action? So I was talking to a game theory professor the other day, and he put it in a way that I hadn't really thought. He said, if the right thing to do under condition P is X, and the right thing to do under condition not P is X, well, for goodness sake, do X.
Yes.
And I just don't know that leaders think in those kind of disciplined terms.
No, and I have a lot of sympathy for chief execs at the moment because the level of noise that comes at them on a regular basis, it makes it very challenging to separate and identify where the signal is, especially when you're under shareholder pressure. So it comes back to the appetite for those difficult and challenging conversations at the outset, where that process will give you the ability to seize opportunity and mitigate risk. Okay. In my experience, there is a particular type of leader that works well in this space. And I can generally tell within 5 minutes of sitting around an executive table how it's going to work. Mm-hmm. And I haven't seen any pattern that lets me identify what the characteristics are of that process. It seems to be a very enlightened leader who has some experience and exposure. What I've seen recently is people with a military background are more likely to be able to function well in a crisis, a military leadership background. That's quite interesting, whether it was, recent or even sometime in their early career, because they understand the necessary levels of decision making to have even in times of crisis, and they understand the need to get ahead of where things are. The other thing in that space, is when I think of it, is that some people often say, well, if you're thinking about foresight, then you're predicting the future. I'm not doing that at all. You can't predict the future. There's a lovely, I'm going to paraphrase a lovely quote, which basically says, plans are useless, but planning is invaluable, because you're never going to find the exact conditions that you specify in a scenario, but you are going to equip people to think better about options when a particular scenario seems to be coming around. So, that's a long answer to your simple question, which is how do leaders get involved? And what I've seen is there doesn't seem to be a clear pattern. It seems to be one of two things. Have they had experience to some sort of military capability before in their leadership training, or do they have a particular personality where they see the value of how this stuff works?
I think curiosity's huge,
Yes.
and not being defensive. And one of the things I find interesting about a lot of organizations is that they start off curious, growth-oriented, entrepreneurial, and then as they become successful, now all of a sudden there's something to protect.
Yes.
And very often, the forces of defensiveness and turf building and hanging on to something that worked in the past become very, very strong. And if your view of the future indicates you need to be doing something really different, that can be very difficult for a lot of the organization to absorb.
Yes, definitely. Cultural inertia is a challenge for many organizations.
Yeah, and what I find also interesting is a lot of organizations, the signals about the future are not something they haven't seen, but it just seems to be something they just can't get themselves to do something about. And I think an interesting example of this is the music business. And if you remember when, back in the day, the sort of existential threat to the music business started off as this basically MP3 file stealing business called Napster, which legally, you and your buddies could share your own albums of songs, and it would be completely pirated and so forth. And the music business tried everything. They tried suing their customers, which I don't think is ever a good customer retention strategy. They tried, earmarking the content, right? Remember Sony had that very unfortunate thing where they were trying to put digital rights management content on the digital song. I mean, they're basically saying, we want to defend the old way. And then this is similar to the video conversation we were having earlier. And then when Steve Jobs came along and said, well, I'll give you a legal platform where you can sell your music and at least it'll be something. And they went along with it. They said, okay. And that was iTunes, right? And then so you now went from a business model where you sold 18 songs or whatever for people to get the one that they wanted. Now you're down to the level of the individual song for 99 cents or whatever it was. And just the inability of that whole sector to move, even when everybody knew this was coming, is quite remarkable to me.
Yes, just hang on, because hanging on has really worked well for us previously. So it's going to hang on again, and we'll see how that goes. And if anyone stops us hanging on, we're going to fight them. That always works.
Do you see sectors in that right now? I'd be interested in your perspective on who do you see kind of operating in that mode right now?
Who's hanging on right now? Advertising. Advertising industry is really hanging on, I see. Also, consultancy firms like the standard ones you'd rattle off. There's clearly a threat around how Agentic AI is changing things rapidly. I use Agentic AI on a regular basis. It is game-changing around what you can achieve. And the idea of billing time and materials for a consultancy basis, which is the model for many of the large consultancy groups, I think that's gone, and they're really hanging on to that. Advertising as well, just hang on.
Yeah, legal.
Legal is a very, very good example, actually. So having people trained to basically memorize cases and law precedents for years and years and years, when now you can just access that at your fingertips. that
It's
model
amazing.
is completely gone.
Yeah, it's amazing. Although I will say that I think a lot of the attention right now, so there was this MIT study from about 6 months ago that surveyed executives and found 95% of them said, they've got no real return on investment in all of that they're doing with AI. And I think there's a root cause to that, which is that we think about AI in terms of specific tasks. So analyze this document or give me the legal precedents for that, or whatever it is. And we haven't really thought enough about agentic AI in particular at the systems level, where you're really rethinking how the whole system works to deliver some kind of valuable outcome.
Yes.
And smarter companies, I think, are doing that.
Yeah, and the speed at which it is changing is quite remarkable. So I would say in the last 4 months, there's been a complete step change in the way I use AI.
Mhm.
And if I was a corporate leader, I have actually advised a group with this just recently at the start of the year, start reverse mentoring. Find your newest employees, find out how they are using AI, and then start understanding how that could be built into what your organization does and what functions do. Because whether you like it or not, they'll be using it almost every day. And it's no use just trying to hold on and defend. You should be really thinking quite differently. And particularly in the corporate environment where some of this innovation needs to go through so many layers of approval and checks and deployments, whereas you or I don't have those levels of restrictions. We can just start using it in ways that are quite extraordinary. And I see a lot of people in similar roles to what we do. We don't have a large organization. You don't have an IT team. You don't have corporate restrictions on large servers. Just using it in ways which almost blow me away on a weekly basis. And you can really see how that's going to come along and completely change the way businesses work. And it's almost like the Netflix example before, or the iTunes example. Now this is how we do things. Don't look over there. This is how we work. Don't look over there. And then all of a sudden, where'd that come from?
Yeah, yeah. So one of the things that I think is an interesting thought experiment, right, is if we're going from the world of mass production to a world of personalization and customization and whatever, and the factors of production have become so cheap and so widely available in many, many sectors. For example, we've had our first, it was a single person, an Israeli guy, who spent 6 months by himself coding this product that was considered so irresistible that Wix paid him $80 million to buy it from it. I mean, it's just astonishing to me. What do you see as the future of the large, multi-layered hierarchy?
That is a great question. And like I said earlier, people don't have the right questions often enough. I don't have a answer that is deserving of the scope of the question right now, but I think spending more time thinking about that particular question is really important right now, because it's not just fast-moving technology that's going to impact that. It's that the world, from a geopolitical view, is reorganizing as well. So there's going to be cultural layers coming through there, ways around how nations organize themselves. All sorts of issues from a cultural level will come through into that as well. And so you can just see the difference between how Chinese manufacturers work and compared to European manufacturers. How was a really good example. How drone development is working in the Ukraine, for example, where research has suggested that the turnaround time for a new update to improve the accuracy and performance of a drone is 7 to 10 days in the Ukraine, simply because of the fast cycles they're working from frontline to manufacture and back again, as opposed to 7 to 10 years for some other defense companies to do updates. I mean, the scale of change is just remarkable, but there's a cultural aspect as well as a technology aspect and a wider sort of context for the operating environment there as well. I don't think it's ever one trigger that's going to create those changes.
No, I don't think so either. I think, I mean, what I'm seeing now is firms, I call it centering. They're really centering themselves, the successful ones anyway, on a much more kind of core organizing principle, that everybody can align behind. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that as uncertainty and dematerialization increase. I think
Yes.
that aspect of leadership is going to be more and more important. So where do our listeners go to learn more about this? How do they get smarter about the
Yes.
future?
And I guess that comes back to where we originally started the conversation, which was a paper I co-authored with George Day at Wharton. And George and I were swapping notes and just looking at how it is that we could have conversations respectively with organizations about the need to think over the horizon, the need to think about new capabilities, the need to think about how their strategy cycle works. And you get that effect I talked about earlier. People just go, I took great notes, job done, here's the notes. And so we
Mm-hmm.
call this the paradox of preparedness. So how is it that listeners might take all this information in and still do absolutely nothing?
Mm-hmm.
And so in that article, we outline a number of very concrete steps that leaders can take. And I would start there as the first point. That's freely available online at the Knowledge at Wharton site. The article, once again, is called The Paradox of Preparedness. And George and I spent a lot of time thinking around how it is that we can have these conversations with leaders and nothing happens.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And did you have a conclusion?
There's lots of conclusions. Be alert to anomalies, so look for weak signals. Hire experts in to boost capability. There's a whole number of things you can do in there. Think about how you value scarce executive time. So, how do you get the attention of leaders who are always really, really busy? An example I've talked about in this conversation is the layer player, where you give them something physical and tangible. There's lots of examples amongst colleagues of mine of people producing really good reports, quite thick, weighty documents. And this colleague of mine told this great story where he was hired by a very large organization by the chief exec to do a piece of work on the future of that particular sector. He did the report. They came back a year later and said, want to update and revise, which is great. At the end of that piece of work, he sat down with the chief exec. The chief exec said, where's the report? He said, I'm not going to give it to you. The chief exec said, what? And he goes, yeah, if you just look behind you in your bookshelf, the last report is sitting in the same place you filed it from our meeting a year ago. So it's, how do you really get the attention of really busy executives? How do you focus them? And how do you use that time valuably when the demands on their attention are so great?
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think a lot of it also is incentives. It's very hard to hear something you don't want to hear.
Yes.
And it's very hard to see something that means maybe what you once knew is going to be no longer relevant. I'm reminded of when electricity was first commercialized in factories. Before that, factories were all designed along a linear flow because you had a single power source, so a steam engine or a river or something. And when electricity came in, all of a sudden, all the different factory pieces could be powered separately. And this is a revolution. But all those people who built their careers on fine tuning, and absolutely optimizing the linear flows and preserving the energy all over the machine. I mean, all of a sudden, they've got the prospect of that whole skill set no longer being valuable. And I think we're seeing a lot of that in the economy today, where people are looking at something and going, my degree, my library, my deep expertise is all of a sudden going to be not as relevant or as useful as it once was. And there's a huge reluctance, I think, to really face up to what that means.
Yes, and that's that cascade I mentioned earlier in the conversation: technology, jobs, politics. And understanding how the impacts of that flow out the bottom of the political cycle was really important, and helps people understand how it is that populist leaders are getting so much traction.
Mm-hmm. Mhm. Well, I think inequality is a big piece, right?
Massive.
And the fact that wages just haven't kept up with productivity gains and all that. And Bill Lazonic from UMass did a fascinating study. It was called Profits Without Prosperity. And it looks at the fact that corporations are doing really well, but the people in them aren't.
Yes, I think it's a really valid point.
Yeah. So what's the most important thing to you that people should take away from this conversation as we move towards wrapping up?
I think you should really value difficult and challenging conversations about topics that you might not otherwise normally consider, either at a boardroom level or at a leadership table level. You should actually structure your cadence of decision making to incorporate that as well. So actually have time on the agenda every week or month, whatever's appropriate for the speed of innovation in your organization and your sector, to have a really well thought out conversation and to avoid the temptation to just squeeze that out because we don't have time. Because, we've got other stuff that's more important operationally right now. You see that all the time. So actually setting up the structure to specifically allow for those conversations, particularly at a board level, is vital right now.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's always a pleasure talking to you, Roger. And maybe one of those days I'll make it down to New Zealand. That would be fun.
You'd be more than welcome. It'd be great to have you here.
Now you've got a couple of books, right, that people could also look up.
I've got articles. I've never really had the time to do books. I'm really in awe of your publishing cycle. It's something that I aim to match one day. But there's a whole range of interviews and articles. So, for example, coming out soon in the Institute of Directors magazine in the UK is a piece about the need to think about geopolitical volatility and the implications on the new corporate code of governance. I've also got podcasts coming out with the Australian Institute of Directors talking about geopolitical volatility and what organisations should do in there as well. And I regularly talk to media outlets too. So there's a whole range of topics, and it's guaranteed to cure anybody's insomnia very quickly.
Well, and you've got a terrific website that has more resources on it as well.
Yes.
So thank you so much for joining me. I have no idea what time it is for you, but I appreciate you carving out the space in the day. And
Right.
to be continued.
Thanks, Rita. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks.